Good afternoon and welcome to the CLEAR webinar series. I'm Dave Dixon, and today we have a webinar on the challenges and benefits of developing a brownfield. This is a collaboration with our UConn TAB program, Technical Assistance on Brownfields. And our presenter today is our very own colleague here at CLEAR, the leader of our Land Use Academy and Climate Adaptation Academy, Bruce Hyde. And he is going to lead us through today's webinar. For those of you who are new to the GoToWebinar format, you should have a control panel on your screen. And if you want to sort of get that out of the way, if it's covering up Bruce or anything like that, and you want to make sure you're staring at Bruce the whole time, you can just hit that little orange button on the control panel that has an arrow in it, and that will close or at least minimize the control panel. If you want to open it back up, you just hit that orange button again, and it will open that back up. You have a couple options in the control panel. You can control your audio, so you can turn up the volume or turn down the volume if you need to, or if you're having trouble connecting, the connection's not very clear, you can switch to a regular phone call and listen that way. There's also a question box in the control panel, and I encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. If there's a point of clarification that I need to make, then I will interrupt Bruce and have him answer that question. Otherwise, we'll save all the questions to the end, but feel free to ask questions as they occur to you. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Bruce. Bruce, take it away.
Thank you, Dave. And if the control panel is covering me up, I encourage you to leave it that way. So welcome to the challenges and benefits of developing a brownfield. Before we get into that, I just wanted to put in a little plug for the UConn TAB program, the Technical Assistance for Brownfields. In Region 1, the services that are provided by the UConn TAB program are direct technical assistance, municipal assistance program, which I'll speak to in a little while, continuing education, and assistance with community engagement. For the direct technical assistance, which the program was very, very busy just a little while ago when applications were due, but there are two folks, professors at UConn, that are very well versed in the application process for both EPA and the state of Connecticut. And one thing I'd like to stop right here and say that a lot of what I'm going to do here is focused on the state of Connecticut for two reasons. One, because that's what I know best, having been involved in brownfields cleanup in the state of Connecticut. And two, it's my understanding that the vast majority of people signed up for this are from the state of Connecticut. So for those of you in other states, I apologize for not being state specific to your states, but I think anything that is in Connecticut, there's a similar program or regulation or restriction in the state that you are in. So the TAB program will provide technical review of documents, including review of environmental site assessments, reports, remedial action plans, and planning documents. They will review proposals for EPA brownfields proposals and state program proposals, and make suggestions and revisions based on what they know from their experience in having produced these kinds of grant applications in the past. There's an evaluation of redevelopment options, looking at what potential site uses are, some of which we're going to be talking about today. How you pay for it, what are the access to resources, and answering any kind of technical questions that you may have. For the Municipal Assistance Program, that is the Brownfields Corps, which is part of the UConn Environmental Corps, and it's a program with students. In the fall semester, they actually work with communities to prepare grant applications for brownfield site assessment and cleanup, and they provide all sorts of technical assistance in doing that. In the spring semester, it's more of a practicum where they'll provide technical support. They can do brownfields site inventories and review site investigations and evaluate redevelopment options. So lest you think that the students just don't do anything and it's just an exercise for the communities to go through, the Brownfields Corps has actually secured 5 EPA funding awards for communities throughout. I guess it's only in the state of Connecticut now, but they are working with other communities in other states in the future, totaling $1.4 million, which is not an insignificant amount of money. And the projects that they're involved in right now as part of the practicum, you can see listed here are some brownfields inventory, looking at redevelopment options, and looking at how to encourage community engagements in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, and New Hampshire. If you want more information on the TAB program, I encourage you to go to tab.program.uconn.edu, and all the information that you could want or hope for is available at that website. And the 2 main players in the TAB program are Dr. Marissa Christoku and Nefeli Bompati. And I can tell you from working with them that these are really some sharp individuals. They know what they're doing, and they are very, very good and can really help you. So brownfields cleanup, it's a complicated process. If you think about how complicated it is for a development to occur on a site which doesn't have any kinds of environmental issues, that's very complicated. But this adds another dimension to the development of an underutilized property. A lot of the underutilized properties are found in urban areas, which has its own challenges, and many of them have been vacant for years, if not decades. The other challenge with dealing with the brownfields cleanup is that it's usually not just one contaminant. It's usually not just petroleum, or it's not just VOCs or PAHs or just one of those things. It's usually a combination of all those things. And the reality is that it probably will require more than just one type of remediation. There's the brownfields catch-22 is what I like to refer it as, and many of the funding programs that are out there are focused in on funding a brownfields cleanup that will result in some sort of development taking place, creating jobs and creating tax base for the community. There are a number of other programs that are out there that are focused on other kinds of end uses of a brownfield, but the vast majority of them do seem to be focused in on some sort of development activity. The other side of that is that developers want some sort of assurance that they can put a shovel in the ground by a certain date, and that's not always able to do that with a brownfields cleanup project because there are so many uncertainties involved in it. And developers are working on 2, 3, 4, even 5 different development opportunities at any one time, so that not having a date certain as to when they can start certainly puts them off a bit about getting involved in a brownfields project. The advantages and risks from a real estate point of view of developing a brownfields, you can see on the right upper chart on the positive side there. Usually brownfields are in pretty prime locations, not always, but a lot of times they're perhaps along a river or a waterfront of some sort. They all have pretty much existing infrastructure to them. There are funding opportunities for the cleanup of brownfields, both at the state and the federal level. And it's a good thing to do. It's a sustainable reuse of the land. On the other side, there's liability associated with it. The time frame can be very long in terms of how the cleanup is progressing, financing issues, and quite frankly, there isn't always a very strong demand for a brownfields redevelopment. There's always not somebody in the private sector out there willing to jump right in and say, geez, I want to develop that brownfield sites because it's the right thing to do. Developers are more interested in not only doing the right thing, but making money. So one of the first things to do in looking at the challenge of how to deal with redeveloping a brownfield is to do a site reuse assessment. and this is to identify what possibilities there are out there for the reuse of the brownfield. You want to look at the opportunities, constraints, and the range of possibilities that might be out there related to the site. You can see there that what's needed are looking at the site characteristics. What's the economy of the area? What kind of demand may there be for what reuse you would like to see? There are perhaps physical and environmental constraints. There might be wetlands. There might be floodplains to deal with. And the regulations. There's always a ton of regulations that somebody has to deal with when developing a normal development site that is not a brownfield. When you add the brownfields component into it, it makes things worse. And finally, one of the big factors is what are the market conditions for real estate? Sometimes we know we've had some pretty serious cycles recently here about development of property, and the market does shift from time to time, and that can cause perhaps a delay in the ability to be able to redevelop a brownfield. Looking at the site reuse assessment, I'm not going to read all of these. You can see there's property information that's needed. There's opportunities and constraints that need to be reviewed. What's the community like? What's the community response going to be to any proposal of redeveloping a brownfield? And finally, one of the biggest is what's the market? Is there a market out there for what the final use is going to be? To get to all of that, you need to develop some sort of an economic development strategy, looking at market studies. What are the zoning regulations? I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these in the future, in just a little while. Wetlands and floodplains, infrastructure, utilities, traffic. How do you get to the site? Is it going to be very, very difficult because there's a lot of narrow streets? Particularly, this is an issue in urban brownfields redevelopment. Are there going to be any kind of remediation restrictions on the property after the property has been remediated? And what's going to happen with the building? As I said, I'll talk about these in a second. So one of the challenges is understanding what you're dealing with. What's the type and level of contamination? So there's all sorts of different types of contamination or pollution. You've got polluted soil, hazardous soil, contaminated soil, polluted fill, and the ubiquitous dirty dirt. So polluted soil, it's soil that's affected by the release of some kind of substance that's at a concentration above the analytical detection limits. And that's a Connecticut definition. And I can assure you that your state has something that's very, very similar. Hazardous soil contains contaminants defined as hazardous waste, and that's defined as something that is dangerous or potentially harmful to our health or the environment. Contaminated soil, soil that contains waste that's not hazardous, but it does have substances that could potentially be harmful to people's health or the environment. And then polluted fill. Soil or sediment which contains polluted substances at the time when such substance, when such soil or sediment was deposited as fill material. And that happens quite a bit in older areas, particularly along waterfronts. There was a time back when people wanted to just fill in wetlands and fill in waterfronts, and they used pretty much anything that was available. It was also a way of getting rid of contaminated soil or contaminated buildings that you really didn't want to deal with anymore, and you just throw them in a wetland. And that is a big source of contaminated properties, as I said, along waterfronts. And then finally, dirty dirt. And dirty dirt really is not a technical term, but a lot of times you'll hear people in the public describe it as one of the previously listed conditions of polluted, hazardous, or contaminated soil. So how do you find out what's there? Well, you do environmental investigations. And these usually are in phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is basically a record search. You look at all the information that might be available as far as the history of the site, looking at environmental files, historical area photos, Sanborn fire insurance maps, and I think most communities have those, and those are actually really kind of fun to look at to see what was what back over the years. City directories, the Connecticut DE, I forgot to put another E in there, any kind of your state's public files, and municipal files in the building department, assessor's office, zoning office, or the health department. An example of one of this is, these are the Sanborn maps. So you can look, this is a section of a Sanborn map. And looking at it, look on the right, there was a wholesale molasses place that had a store and all sorts of other associated uses. But to the left of it, on this, you can see there was storage of kerosene, storage of empty barrels, and God only knows what could be in those empty barrels, and coal bins, which has its own associated problems with it in terms of coal tar and coal dust and all sorts of other contaminants related to coal. And you may look at the Sanborn maps and think, geez, that's not the same kind of land configuration that I see today. And here's an example of that. You can see this area right here is New Haven Harbor, and the same area in today versus 1886. On the right's New Haven Harbor, which is the Sanborn map, and on the left is New Haven, IKEA, and associated development. And that was all a result of fill being put in New Haven Harbor. Phase 2, sampling soils and groundwater. There's all sorts of different techniques to do that. It could be by drilling, hand augering, or other hand tools. With the soil side of things, groundwater sampling is putting in monitoring wells and monitoring them over time. And what this will do is give you some idea of specific areas that may have contamination on the property. It's not going to tell you the total extent of the contamination, but it's going to give you some idea of where the areas of concern may be. And finally, phase 3, which is basically a further evaluation of the extent of the contamination, just trying to figure out just how far it's gone. If you find an area of concern, start doing more testing out away from that and seeing how far the contamination goes away from it. It's not like you have a 6-acre property and all 6 acres is going to be contaminated. So you really need to focus in on the areas, what the problem is and what is the extent of the problem. This is something I talked about a little earlier, which is a challenge. Is the site marketable? Is it marketable for anything that will produce tax revenue and jobs? And to do that, you need a market analysis, and you need a really good market analysis that is realistic. I've seen a whole bunch of market analysis and municipal development plans and grand plans that look really, really good on paper, but they're totally unrealistic because there is no market for those kinds of things to actually occur on that particular site. In some cases, some of these properties may be better used as open space as opposed to something that is producing tax revenue and jobs. Or the challenge is, if you are going to focus in on producing tax revenue and jobs, and that's the only thing you're willing to do, that site may sit vacant for decades. So it's really important that you be realistic about what is possible for the redevelopment of a particular brownfield site. The challenges of site consideration. What are the abutting uses to a site? If you have a site that's part of an industrial area and you decided that you want to put condominiums or office buildings or something of that nature in the middle of this, it's not necessarily going to occur or make any sense because the surrounding area is not something that's compatible with that type of use. What's the area zoned? And are you willing to change the zoning. For the most part, I found that communities, when somebody comes along with a really good idea, even if it doesn't conform with zoning, communities are more than willing to change the zoning to accommodate that. And that really does make sense. Traffic issues, site access. Is the site at an interstate interchange? Well, if it's in an interstate interchange, it's got a lot more appeal because of the access to it than if it's buried somewhere in the middle of a dense urban area with narrow streets to get to it. And the other challenge is it fragmented land ownership? Do you have a bunch of different brownfield sites all in one area, but all owned by different people who may have different interests in how the land is developed or what they're going to do with the land? I talked about this a little bit before, but is the site being developed on its own, or is it part of a grand plan? Do you want to just try to focus in on maybe one site and build from there? Or do you want to try and do everything all at once, which is a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult project to carry out? Is it infill or part of a grand master plan? And are you willing to give tax breaks? Most communities are willing to say, okay, we'll abate your taxes for the first 10 years if you invest X millions of dollars of money in it, in developing a particular brownfield site. The regulatory process is perhaps one of the biggest challenges in developing a brownfield site. You have to decide whether the level of cleanup is going to be compatible with the proposed use. And the level of cleanup needed for an industrial use is different than the level of cleanup needed for a residential use. So you've got to look at it and say, what is realistic in terms of the amount of money that we need to expend to clean this property up in order to achieve what we want for our end use? There's a much longer development approval process, a regulatory process, and this could have a developer issue relative to the timing. Sometimes I've run into, actually did run into this when I was dealing with a cleanup project called the New London Mills site, which I'll talk a little bit later about, was conflicting interests of the regulatory agencies. There was a bunch of linoleum that was dumped in part of the river, the Thames River, from when it was, the site was a linoleum factory. And one of the state agencies wanted to just leave it where it was and not stir up the contamination. And another one of actually it was the same agency, another one of the divisions at that agency wanted to dig it all up and get it out of there. I finally walked out of a meeting and said, when you decide what you want me to do, let me know. But there could be conflicting interests in terms of regulatory agencies. And if there are any kind of restrictions put on the property, those restrictions run with the land. I'll talk about that in a little while also. Actually, I'm going to talk about it right now. Environmental land use restrictions. This is a Connecticut definition. It's an easement that's granted to the state by the property owner, recorded on the municipal land records, and its purpose is to minimize the risk of human exposure to pollutants by restricting certain things that you can do on the property, preventing specific uses or activities, or on the whole property or portion of the property. And it does run with the land and recorded on the municipal land records. I've repeated that there because it's very important to understand. It's not something that you can just sort of ignore after it's all done. So there are two types, basically, of land use restrictions. And as I said, this is the state of Connecticut. Your state, I am sure, has very, very similar kinds of restrictions. Soil and groundwater. And you can see from this chart there, I'm not going to go all the way through it, but when you have certain kinds of restrictions, whether it be residential activity or building construction or groundwater use, you can see on the right there that all of those boxes start out with the word can't, which means you can't do any of those things. Another challenge is dealing with inaccessible soil. What happens if you have a building that's on top of soil that's contaminated? Well, it's pretty much inaccessible. Or if it's below pavement, or it's perhaps so far down below a park or a grassy area that it's considered to be inaccessible. So these are what's considered to be inaccessible soil is either under a building, which you can't remove, 2 feet under a pavement, or 4 feet under a grassy area. That at that point is considered to be inaccessible and has really can't be remediated in any kind of meaningful way. Another challenge is the building condition. You have buildings there that might be salvageable. They have historic preservation considerations about tearing them down, forcing you to consider salvaging something you may want to have really, really torn down. You need to do a structural assessment, look at the building envelope and mechanical systems and the foundation, and are there any areas that are leaking and causing additional problems with the structure of the building. Funding, always one of the big challenges. Anytime you deal with a brownfields remediation for a development project, you have much higher upfront capital costs. There are more limited financing opportunities. There may be financing opportunities with programs at the state and the federal level, but they may be limited when you go to a bank and say, I want to borrow money to develop on a brownfields. Sometimes the banks aren't real keen on that, or some sort of other financing source that you may be looking at. There's lots of competition for scarce resources at both the federal and the state level. And again, one of the ways of providing some funding to help these projects along is through tax breaks for the municipality. Let's talk a little bit about the benefits of brownfield redevelopment, and there's a lot of them. And it's really good if something like this can happen. Eliminating health and safety hazards, eliminating eyesores, bringing new jobs into the community and new investment into the community, making the land that may have been fallow for years or even decades back into productive use. It will also increase the property values and tax receipts by local and state governments. One of the things to be careful with, however, is that increased property values may negatively impact residents of disadvantaged neighborhoods. And somehow that may need to be mitigated. You don't want to get into a situation where you have remediated a property and put in this great, wonderful development for the community, but the net effect of that is gentrification. And residents who have been living with and suffering through a brownfield site right next to them all of a sudden can no longer live there as the area starts to develop and become improved because they are priced out of the area. And in general, it just improves the quality of life in a community. So I don't think there's a better way than to show what the benefits of brownfields redevelopment are than to go through success stories in states that in the states that make up Region 1. In Connecticut, the project that I was involved with was the New London Mills site. It was a 24-acre site on the Thames River that had a whole variety of different uses over the years. The contaminants that you can see on the bottom there that were found were PCBs, lead, arsenic, VOCs, petroleum, and this isn't really necessarily a contaminant, but an artillery shell was turned up when the plant apparently was at one point manufacturing artillery shells for World War II. The backhoe operator told me he's never moved so fast in his entire life. And this is an example of the fact that you may think you know what's on the site, and you think you've identified all the contaminants, but when you start getting in there and digging, it can change. It delayed the cleanup of the site while the state police bomb squad came down and dealt with the disposal of the artillery shell. Right now, it's used by Electric Boat for designing the next generation of nuclear submarines. There's over 1,500 jobs. And one of the advantages of this is that it has spawned a lot of spin-off residential development for the engineers and other personnel that are occupying the site. And as you can see, it just looks a little bit better. In Rhode Island, there's Meeting Street Educational Center. This is a great project. Found were lead, arsenic, VOCs, and petroleum products. Petroleum products. This was taken and changed into an educational center with athletic fields, parking. There's 100,000 square feet of buildings. There's an early childhood educational program in schools that serve over 7,000 economically disadvantaged children and their families each year. And this is a wonderful example of what can be done that's in an urban area with a brownfield to benefit the community. In Massachusetts, the United Shoe Machinery Corporation in Beverly. It was originally a shoe manufacturing facility that manufactured rubber shoe and sole parts, and at one point was manufacturing boots for soldiers during World War II. Found there were oil, solvents, PCBs, PAHs, and I'm sure some other things. And now, and this is a huge success story also, 4,000 commercial tenants occupying 2 million square feet of space, 3,400 workers, and this also spawned some spin-off development, 15-acre parcel adjacent to it for the development of a yacht club, a park, a supermarket, and retail shops. In Vermont, the Goodyear Tire Manufacturing, Goodyear Tire Manufacturing was the one that did rubber shoes and sole parts. I apologize for that mistake. There was demolition waste, asbestos, and one of the challenges with this was that it was in a floodplain. So rather than look at trying to put some sort of commercial, industrial, or residential property there, they elected to go with a solar array system that now produces 500 kilowatts of energy and contributes toward the town's and the region's renewable energy goals. And one of the things I tried to do with all of these examples is to come up with a sort of a variety of how brownfields have been reused. And I think this is a great example of some really creative thinking about the reuse of a brownfield. It also does a wonderful job toward renewable energy and carbon mitigation. For New Hampshire, the former Pillsbury Mill, which just coincidentally was a flour mill, surprisingly. And there were waste chemicals, asbestos, containing materials, storage tanks, transformer consumed for saying PCBs. And that was contaminated also with lead and barium. And excuse me, it has been turned into a wonderful riverfront park for the community of Tilton, New Hampshire. And finally, the last on our list is the T.W. Dick Mill in Gardner, Maine. Down there were petroleum, asbestos, VOCs, PAHs, and lead. And that now is a medical facility and residential uses. So these are sort of the success stories, I think, that show the benefits of brownfield remediation and what can be achieved. One thing I'd also like to end with here is something about highest and best use. There's thousands of brownfield sites in New England, probably tens of thousands of brownfield sites in New England, which range anywhere from large, mills and factory sites to gas stations. And if you look closely at the gas station there, you'll see the S has fallen off the name, and it says hell. And that is probably what a lot of people think of as brownfield sites that have been unremediated and not redeveloped for decades. And I think we have to make some choices and think about how we're reusing brownfield sites and what the ultimate goal ought to be. Do we hold out and say, well, we're not going to do anything until somebody comes along with a development that's going to produce jobs and tax base? Or do we kind of look at it from a different angle and say, well, one of the big challenges we're facing now is climate change. And can we look at combining cleanup of brownfield sites with resilience to climate change? Can we find sites that are in urban areas where one of the climate issues is urban heat islands? And in some cities where there are a lot of impervious surfaces and it's very densely populated, the temperature can be anywhere between 2 and 8 degrees hotter than in suburban areas. And in a lot of these areas that are densely populated are in areas with underserved populations where there aren't air conditioning, where there aren't parks, where there aren't trees to provide shade. And is there a way that we could rethink some of how the money is spent and focus on programs that might address the issues of urban heat islands by taking factories and brownfield sites that are in urban areas, and instead of trying to turn them into job and revenue producing sites, turn them into a site that is going to improve the quality of life in a community by lowering the temperature and providing a recreational and shade place for the residents of those communities. And the other area would be in addressing coastal resiliency. One of the Brownfields core students that I had in class several years ago did a report on brownfields and sea level rise, and looking at recommendations for how to turn brownfields into areas that could act as areas for sumps to resist storm surge and resist sea level rise. And incidentally, that person happens to be hired as the Director of Sustainability for the City of Bridgeport. And I'm sure he's going to continue to work on doing that. So that's sort of my little pitch on maybe rethinking how we focus programs at the federal and state level on the cleanup of brownfields, and seeing if we can't start thinking about it in terms of climate resiliency also. And with that, I'll take any questions that people may have.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. We have had a couple questions come in here. Thank you for that presentation. The first one is somewhat of a comment, but I think there's also a question in here. The person says it would be nice to have studies on some of these success stories from beginning to end. As someone who is relatively new in the Brownfields area and a grantee of EPA for assessment and remediation, they'd love to see how the project started, how they progress from start to finish, and what kinds of partnerships are beneficial. And so I think the question that I'll add on to that is, do you know places where folks can go to get those kind of like in-depth case studies or success stories?
That's a really good question. And I honestly don't know, other than contacting the communities themselves to be able to get that kind of information. If you Google, brownfields cleanup success stories in New England or in Maine or New Hampshire or whatever, EPA has a lot of like fact sheets, but it does not go into a lot of the details about some of the nitty gritty of what people had to go through in order to make brownfields a success. As I said, it's a good question, and the only thing I can really think of is to get in touch with the individual communities, the planning department there, or the economic development department, and ask if they'd be willing to spend some time to talk about it. Most people who have a success in terms of a brownfield redevelopment are very happy to share what they went through, what some of the roadblocks were, what some of the the headaches and the disasters that they foresaw coming up that they managed to solve. And I think that's the best way to do it.
Great, thanks, Bruce. And that may be something that we'll share with the folks leading the TAB program as well, as maybe a suggestion of things that they could do, is create some of those sort of more in-depth stories. Next question is, considering that larger sites have more potential uses, however, there are many smaller sites, less than an acre. Any ideas for redevelopment of those smaller sites?
Well, I think I would go back to what I was just talking about at the end there. Parks, green space, improve the quality of life, particularly if you're talking about in a densely populated urban area. Make a little space where people can go and relax. There are possibilities of infill construction, but I think those are very, very difficult to do depending on what the surrounding area is.
Okay, those are all the questions that are in the question box right now. I have one that I will ask and sort of stall a little bit for those who are maybe typing in a question now or have a question they want to type into the question box. So my question is, perception that a site is contaminated can be just as, I guess, prohibitive of development or slowing people considering a site for development as actual contamination can be. And so how can communities get over that perception? So particularly if there's a gas station, there's a couple of them in my community right now. There's a couple of gas station sites that, are no longer operating. And whether they're contaminated or not, nobody necessarily knows, but people assume that it is because it's a gas station site. So how does a community overcome that in seeking to try to redevelop that property?
The only way is that I can think of is to do some sort of a environmental assessment so that you can definitively say what the problem is. There's no way of overcoming that perception issue other than with facts, and the facts can only be obtained by doing an environmental assessment.
Okay. And they'd have to get the property owner's permission or something like that, or they would have to take over the ownership of the property to be able to do that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't go on somebody else's property and do anything unless they give you permission.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, those are all the questions that we have, Bruce. I thank you for an excellent presentation on challenges and benefits. I think it weighs in the benefits favor based on that, but there are certainly challenges to getting there. So I thank you for that. Unless you have any final words, we'll close it out.
No, I do.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today, everybody. We have another webinar coming up next week on stormwater utilities for folks who are interested in that. And then there will be a webinar, I believe it's June 1st. There's another in this technical assistance on Brownfield series webinars. So hopefully we'll see you on one of those two upcoming webinars. Thanks a lot, folks. Talk to you soon.